We are about the truth and will never shy away from telling the truth. We're about protecting the vulnerable.
There is this false belief that if you force people to live together, they would eventually start liking each other more, and they would reconcile, and it would be good for relations, when what actually almost always happens is when you force people to live together, it leads to more friction in the long run as opposed to less friction.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for talking to me. Tell me first and foremost, what has the experience been like the past month or 2 months for you?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. It's good to speak with you, and I'm very happy that there is such focus on what is happening in South Africa at the moment, and on the Afrikaner people. It's in a certain sense as if we are being rediscovered, for which we are very grateful, because we've been treated like pariahs and outcasts for several decades. And it felt for quite a long time, at least virtually my entire lifetime, it felt as if the Afrikaner people have been deliberately forgotten. And it's as if we are sort of re-entering the international conversation. So I'm very grateful about that. This past few months have been very exciting, obviously very alarming also, looking at what's happening in South Africa, what some of the threats that we are facing in South Africa, the extent to which the ruling party, the ANC in South Africa, and the government are increasingly becoming radicalized, becoming more dangerous in terms of the policies they want to implement. So that's alarming. But it's almost bittersweet. But combined with that, and perhaps partly because of that, we find this increased interest in what's happening in South Africa, and it's quite something for me also to look back to think that just within the last month, I had conversations with, you mentioned them, with Tucker Carlson, Jordan Peterson, and Ben Shapiro, and Matt Gaetz, I think in the last 2 months, to be fair.
Yeah.
And these are names, people I've been following for some time, probably for the last decade or so. And I never expected that they would have this interest in South Africa and in our cause. And not just that, but also that they would be so supportive. Now, I've known Tucker for a while, since 2018. Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro I met now a month ago. But what I can say about all of these people that I mentioned, and many others, is that they are not just interested from a sort of newsworthiness perspective, but they are interested because they really support what we are doing, and they really want to help. And all of these people, after the interviews we had, they asked me, what can we do to help? Is there anything else I can do? To which platforms could we get you? Can we invite you to speak at some conferences? Can we call people to speak to you? Tell us how we can help you. And I've been giving some pointers to some of these people, and they've followed through on that. So I'm really grateful about that.
Tucker Carlson, I imagine, played a key role in facilitating a number of these interviews. Was he the key man? Because you've met him some years ago. I know on Fox News you did an interview with him about farm murders in South Africa. Is that where the first seeds were sown for this ultimate venture that you've just gone through now?
In a certain sense, I want to say no, because of the interviews that we just discussed, they were not opened up or facilitated by Tucker directly. I think indirectly, in the sense that my exposure on his program has helped. But a lot of people have asked me about this, sort of the process that I've followed, or that we followed, to get to these platforms. And maybe I should someday write it down, but the core of it is it's about network building, about reaching out to certain people, having something to contribute to the conversation, not just leaving that person with a sense that you wasted his or her time, convincing that person of your cause, and then in some cases making friends with that person, but also not just for the sake of benefit, but actually because there's some things in common, and then just broadening the networks gradually. And so the way I got to Tucker in 2018 was through a network of contacts that we've been working on. Back then I was with AfriForum still, especially in Washington, D.C. And some people have said to me, listen, one person in particular said to me, listen, I don't actually know Tucker Carlson, but I do have contact with him, and I'm going to reach out to him because I think he should speak with you. And incidentally, I didn't know that at the time. He told me that when I met him in 2018, he was busy reading Thomas Pakenham's book, The Boer War. And he was reading this book, and he told me that he sort of grew up with the English narrative on the Boer War, and reading that book, and the book is not a pro-Boer book or pro-English. It's sort of the standard neutral version, as neutral as you can get, at least on the Boer War. And as he was reading that book, he discovered that he's more on the side of the Boers than the English in that war. And he was reading that while he was watching the news about what's happening in South Africa. And then this email came through from this person whose opinion he respected. And this person said, you should speak with Ernst. And so that's how I got to him. The other interviews have similar stories, people who open up particular channels to particular people. But Tucker has been very helpful. I can say that in terms of speaking with people, opening up lines of communication, reaching out to people, and we are really very, very happy.
But one of the things I sort of was wondering by myself was this part of an organized campaign by Ernst himself? No, you're sitting and figuring out for yourself your future with AfriForum. You obviously have plans. You've obviously got some dynamics going on within the organization. Was it part of a planned action campaign by Ernst Roets himself, or was there something in South Africa? Because I know how the news world work, and a newsman, a person, and that's what Tucker really is a classic news person. They would follow the news. So one of the questions I had was, did something really happen in South Africa that kind of caught his attention, that he then thought, well, I got to talk to Ernst about that?
Are you talking about the recent interview, or
I talk about the first interview of Tucker now. What motivated from his point of view that interview?
That was sparked by the decision of the South African Parliament in February 2018.
Okay, so there was indeed a news peg on that. It was the newsman who saw
it was about the whole thing of expropriation without compensation.
Okay.
And so that started in February. I think it was May when I spoke with Tucker. So we've sort of done some lobbying after, obviously AfriForum did a lot of things in 2018, but one of these things was, and at least my role in AfriForum was reaching out to people abroad.
Okay. But that was what triggered the whole in his ears were triggered by what was going on in South Africa and around this bill. I read somewhere, and I'm not quite sure whether this is really something that happened or not, but a lot of reactions, obviously, and you've been very, very busy the past couple of weeks. I imagine that in some ways your life must have changed a little bit. But I also read somewhere that you also received death threats. Tell me about that. How did all of this impact your life back in South Africa?
Okay, so before I get to the threats, yes, my life has changed dramatically. So let me just say that in leaving, so technically I moved from AfriForum to the Solidarity Movement in 2023, a year and a half ago, you could say. And I was at the Solidarity Movement office. AfriForum is part of the Solidarity Movement, but I was at, I don't know if you should say the head office, but I was at the central office of the Solidarity Movement for this past year. And I took that leap in February, I think, this year. And it's not as if there was a big fight or some scandal or something to that effect. I did express this internally for some time, that I increasingly feel that I don't have space to maneuver, that there are certain things that I could do that I wasn't able to do. And there are many reasons for that. But I'm still a member of the Solidarity
Yeah.
movement. I'm still a
Yeah.
member of Solidarity and AfriForum and the Helping Hand and all these institutions.
Yeah.
But the appropriate metaphor I would think that I actually thought of was it Cortez, the in Southern America, I think when he went to Mexico, there's that famous story of the so-called burning of the ships.
Mm-hmm.
So what he did was they invaded this country, and he was concerned that his people would want to flee, and so he burned his ships. That's the legend.
Yeah.
Apparently, he didn't burn his ships. He dismantled them so that the people knew they don't have the option of going back. Now, the problem with the ship burning metaphor is it could be confused with bridge burning.
Yeah.
I don't think that I burned my bridges.
Yeah.
Obviously, a decision like this is an uncomfortable decision, and there are some uncomfortable conversations. But what I just mean by that is that I decided I'm going to take this leap, and I had a good salary, and I was pretty sure, at least professionally speaking, of where I am, and I resigned up to the point of being unemployed, literally unemployed, and then starting something new.
Yeah.
And so, in that sense, I took a leap from an organization with hundreds of thousands of members to being just by myself. That was a big decision. Also, and with that came a lot of uncertainty, but I do think that it was the right decision. I think I can truly say, looking back, that just looking at what happened this last month and what is still ahead, what is already planned for the months ahead, that it was the right decision.
Yeah.
And I think I now have a lot of work to do in terms of building this new institution.
Yeah.
In terms of the threats, yes, I don't want to talk about that too much, not because I'm concerned or afraid, but simply because a lot of people I've seen, and to me, it's become somewhat annoying that someone comes out, especially if it's some celebrity, some singer or actor, takes a stance about something political, and that person gets criticized, then that person comes out 2 days after and say, "Oh, I got death threats," as if you're playing. It's so it feels like playing the victim. But yes, I did get that. I don't take threats on social media too seriously. In other words, if someone just sends you a tweet, you get a lot of tweets. So I'm not too concerned about that. But some were quite grotesque and very explicit, especially because I spoke. So I didn't expect when I had this recent interview with Tucker that we would talk about Winnie Mandela. I think that was like his second question, was why did Nelson Mandela go to prison? And we spoke about Winnie Mandela and the necklacings and so forth. And so some people were quite angry with that. And so I got quite a few threats from people saying that they're going to wait for me at the airport and they're going to necklace me when I get back home. But I think that just it's unfortunate, but I don't think we should let things like that.
Yeah, but it will appear to me that if you do what you've just done now, it is. I think perhaps, and I think it might be even bigger than what you imagine it yourself, because you're in the middle of it all. It's huge what you've done now. You've really put the spotlight on the country. You say certain things. I think that you're smart enough to know that it is going to annoy or upset some people, at least, and there's a lot of crazy people out of the world. But okay, I don't want to dwell on that too much. In terms of you leaving AfriForum Solidarity, is it fair to say, and of course I'm also just another old journalist who talks to other journalists, is it fair to say that Ernst Roets felt himself constrained by these organizations in some form or another? And the language I've heard from people in private conversations is Ernst wants to have more of an activist approach to things. In other words, what I hear from friends in the discussion about all of this, because obviously you much talked about, and what you've done is much talked about in all kitchens, not only in South Africa, but also here in Europe, the suggestion has been placed that you felt constrained by the organization and that you would prefer a more activist approach towards what you feel needs to be done in South Africa.
Yes, I think that's fair. Although I don't really, we actually had a conversation about the word activism recently, shortly before I resigned. And my view on that is that I don't actually think of myself as an activist, although it's probably fair to say that I am an activist, but I do think of myself more as if I should choose a term to describe myself, I would much rather use the term a communicator than an activist.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, someone that conveys a particular message and tries to get support for that message. And so it's not so much that I want to be more activistic. And maybe the reason why I say this is because I think of activism as, student activism, blindfolding yourself or tying yourself up to a pole, that type of very creative activism that I was very much involved with in my student days.
Yeah.
So it's not so much that it's more, you could say that I want to play a more activistic role, but I think it has more to do with freedom to communicate.
Or let me put it in simple terms, Ernst, is it a little bit more pressure on the pedal is kind of what I hear you saying.
Perfect.
Exactly. A bit more assertive is probably a polite way of saying that. A question I have to ask, you've obviously been asked this question a million times. Are you not in creating, and I'm going to use the word yet very specific here, yet a new organization, are you not doing what we've always done, fracturing Afrikaner unity a touch more?
Yeah, well, so I've seen this a lot the last month. People saying, why are there so many organizations, and we need to get them together. And some people go as far as saying what we actually need is one big organization to represent us. Now, I have a fundamental problem with that, or I fundamentally disagree with that approach. And one way to describe it is I'm a big fan of N.P. van Wyk Louw. I love reading his work, and I think about his work a lot. And I think probably his most well-known quote, or at least one of it, is he says that the circulation of ideas for a people or for a folk is as important as the circulation of blood is for the body. And so the problem with one big organization, and that's not, let me just say that I don't think what I'm saying now differs in any way from what the Solidarity movement would say or what they have been saying. The problem with one big organization is it leaves little room for nuanced differences and different approaches within the community. Some people want to take a harder line. Some people want to be more diplomatic. People have, and so if you have a variety of institutions, then you find a place where everyone feels at home. So I'm very much in favor of diversity in that sense. But with that said, I do think it's important for these organizations to work together, or if they don't work together, at least respect each other's intentions. I'm really, really annoyed by some people in Afrikaner circles on the right who spent all of their time or most of their time trying to discredit what other Afrikaners are doing. And so I have a saying in this regard. I say that a verraaier or a traitor, if the definition of a traitor is someone that attacks his own people, then why do we think that a traitor can always be on the left? You can have traitors on the right of you as well. And I think we have that. In other words, just people spending all their time trying to discredit what others are doing and trying to accuse them of malicious intent and so forth. And so the point that I'm trying to make is it's good to have different organizations. It's good to have different approaches. And I think we should respect each other's intentions and work together. I think
and perhaps what Van Wyk Louw also says in that is that if you have a greater variety of these voices, it seems to me there will be more dynamism as well. It will create more dynamics in the whole discussion as well.
Yes, so that's one part, and the other part I didn't say is if you have a diversity of institutions, you can have specialization. So if you have one institution that has to, the example I often use is Apple computers versus the Apple strategy versus the Virgin strategy. I'm a bit critical of the Virgin strategy in the sense that, to my mind, it's built very much around the brand of Richard Branson. Um, and I'm not so sure, just from an organizational strategic perspective, if it's a good idea to have one company that
Yeah.
does mobile phones, but also has gyms and also has an
Yeah, I
airline.
understand what you're saying. Yeah.
And so the Apple strategy is very much, especially at least under Steve Jobs, very focused on a very particular thing that they want to develop. And so if you have a variety of institutions, they can each follow the Apple
Yeah.
strategy
Yeah.
and be very focused. And again, they can, so you can have an institution that focuses on safety and security and do
Yeah.
that extremely
Yeah.
well. You can have one that focuses on protecting the culture
Yeah.
and encouraging poetry and linguistics and philosophy and so forth. And you can have a variety. That's
Yeah.
the point.
What is the core mission of the pioneer movement?
Well, the core mission is, let me just interject myself quickly to say this is a very new thing. It's so new that even the name Pioneer Initiative is a preliminary name. Actually, just before speaking with you, I was working on a document with a list of
Okay.
sort of a short list of names from
Aha.
which we have to choose what
Okay.
will be the name.
Okay. I get it.
But the core mission is firstly a problem statement, and the problem statement is that the political dispensation in South Africa is not sustainable.
Uh-huh.
It's in, I want to say, in no one's interest, but you could say it's only in the short-term interest of the political elites, those in power in South Africa, but it's by no means in the interest of any community in South Africa. And so the core mission is to say that this is not sustainable. We need something else that is not moving backwards, but moving forward. And so I've stressed this quite a bit in the interviews I've done, that there is this false dichotomy in South Africa, or with regard to South Africa, that you have to choose between the apartheid system, or you have to choose between the National Party system and the ANC system. And if you don't want the ANC system, then by definition you want apartheid.
Yeah.
And the fact is that you can reject both. You can say that the apartheid system didn't work. What we have now isn't working. We need something better. We need to learn from both these mistakes. And so the core objective of the Pioneer Initiative is to say that let's work towards some form of a political dispensation that is more sustainable.
Yeah.
And we say that the two most important building blocks for that is decentralization of political power and self-governance. Now, self-governance could take different forms, but the principle of self-governance, at least, is to bring the government closer to the people.
Okay.
And as far as we can be able to achieve that, we argue that it would be a more sustainable system.
Yeah, yeah. Now let me unpack this the way I understand it. Yeah, what you're saying to me is that your problem statement that you've identified is this is not working. That's the point of departure. Then you say, well, we are going to think about what can we do to actually bring about a healthy situation in the country.
Yes.
The question I'm really sort of digging at here a little bit is, what is different about what the Pioneer Initiative, or whatever you may call this initiative in the future, what is different? Is it a strategy that's different? Is it core ideals or ideas that's different? What's different from that which I would imagine AfriForum and Solidarity and virtually all other movements, similar movements or groupings, have not been keeping themselves busy with for the past at least 30 years?
So obviously I cannot speak for them anymore on their behalf, but AfriForum is very much a community organizing institution. It places a lot of emphasis on organizing local communities. The Onsal Self approach, fixing potholes, is the well-known example, but AfriForum does much more than that. Community safety structures, getting people to drive patrols to keep the communities safe. And also there's the civil rights side of it, fighting against expropriation without compensation, taking matters to court. Solidarity is more, traditionally it was a trade union, although I don't think the term trade union is applicable or as appropriate anymore as it was. It's a workers' movement, you could say, to protect you in the work environment and encourage education and training and so forth. And none of these things that I've mentioned now are things that we will focus on with the Pioneer Initiative. The focus is much more narrow.
Okay, there
In
we
a
go.
certain sense, it's a think tank, but it's a more activistic think tank.
Yeah.
So we don't focus on community organizing. I don't foresee us being involved with court cases. It might be possible, but I don't foresee that. And because what we are saying is that we need to find a macro political solution.
Okay.
And the micro political side of it is very important because that's the bread and butter stuff that people experience every day. But this focus is much more on the macro political problem and the macro political solution. In other words, to say that the problem in South Africa is not that the wrong person is the president. It's not that the wrong party won the election. It's that the system facilitates a particular or enables a particular type of government that is detached from realities on ground level. And so I think this is part, again, I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I think this is part of what some of the institutions in the Solidarity movement are looking into. But this is the core focus and the only focus of
Okay,
Pioneer.
no, I get it. I understand what you're saying. What you're saying is really is that AfriForum is doing what it's doing, and it's doing it well, and so is Solidarity doing what it's doing. That's not going to be. We are going to razor-like focus on this essential question, namely
on the political system, you could say.
Okay, I get that. Now, to try to understand where you're going to with all of this, because we've now heard, and I've now heard these words: devolution of power, decentralization, regional autonomy, more autonomy. We've heard, it becomes kind of like a mush of words with no real meaning.
Self-determination, self-governance, all there are so many terms.
And everybody is banding it around, and it kind of sort of hangs in the air there. And I'm trying to figure out, let me ask the question like this: what is it not? And then I'm going to put in brackets the other call. Let's talk about geographic independence, a piece of ground independence, my little piece of land independence, a la Urania, whatever the case may be. So I understand the idea of focusing on how would the structures look like. Let's go and puzzle that out. But what is it not?
Well, that's a very good way of asking it. And I could answer it in a few ways. One is it's not centralized power, but it's not statism. In other words, it's not. It's deliberately trying, even though we live in the era of the modern state, but it does seem, again, from a macro perspective, that the modern state as we know it today is increasingly under threat, and the question is whether the world as we know it today would still operate as such in 50 or 100 years in terms of how the state operates, just with a lot of varieties, a lot of things that contribute to that. But so it's not statism. And I think maybe one way to say is it's an attempt to look at natural solutions as opposed to artificial solutions. And this could be a very controversial thing to say, but the way I differentiate between the two is a natural, or you could say natural identity as opposed to artificial identity. And a natural identity is something that is just naturally part of who you are. Like your cultural identity, the language that you speak, the tradition in which you grew up, and so forth. That's just naturally who you are. An artificial identity is something that is man-made, something that you made up. Now, there are many artificial identities today. The most extreme examples are these new woke identities, and people regard themselves as part of the trans community or something like that. So people make up these new identities, and then they decide that is their identity. But the controversial part is to say that South Africanism is also, in a certain sense, an artificial identity. It's because it's a statist identity. It's to say that you are a citizen of this particular state, and therefore that is your identity. Now, artificial identity, in other words, being a South African, is a form of an artificial identity because the South African state is a man-made construct, while you could say culture is also man-made, but there's a difference between being born in a particular cultural community, which just naturally flows from who we are, as opposed to people coming together, having a meeting and writing, the articles of the state. So I think therein lies an important difference. But an artificial identity is not necessarily a bad thing. The problem comes in when an artificial identity prescribes that you should abandon your natural identity. And practically speaking, what I mean by that is when the idea of being a South African becomes in conflict with being an Afrikaner, for example. When people say you cannot be an Afrikaner anymore because you are a South African. When an Afrikaner identity is a natural identity and South African identity is an artificial identity. And you can have both. But when the artificial one starts trying to suppress the natural one, that is problematic. And so we need to find solutions that are more inclined towards natural identities and natural solutions than artificial ones.
Yeah, well, it is very provocative, I would imagine, to a lot of people, but I think I fully understand what you're saying. My only problem and why I keep on going back to this piece of land, this physical something, this geographic something, is because, well, there is this border that has been constructed in, what was it, 1911, when the Union of South Africa was found. And you are basically saying, if I understand you correctly, is that's not a natural boundary that defines who you are, or who I am, or who the Zulu person is, or who the Xhosa person is. The problem, if I just this for a moment, Ernst, just to make it clear in my head, what I'm also trying to get to is, I understand the idea of the natural identities, but it does come in conflict with the, let's call it, for the sake of this discussion, the actual drawn identities.
Yes. So borders could be natural. Borders are by definition natural, but you can draw a border in an artificial way also. And I do think that South Africa, the South Africa we knew before 1910 was a more natural South Africa, because I don't know if colonization is natural, but the idea of several republics, kingdoms, the Zulu kingdom and so forth. And then the idea of just lumping everything together, drawing a border and saying, now this is the union, this is your new identity, is a move away from what is natural towards what is artificial. But I think that, let's put it this way. And if we were to do a SWOT analysis of where we are now with this Pioneer Initiative, and the thing that I'm trying to explain to you, I would say one of our weak points at the moment is that we're not in a position to describe a very clear destination. And I don't think we should. I got an email this morning from one of our contributors. I encourage our contributors all the time to send me input, and there were some very useful inputs. But one spoke about the danger, if you're working with, you could say, some form of a movement, a political movement, the danger of working with a plan as opposed to an agenda. And why it's better to work with an agenda than to work with a plan. And that to me was very useful, because the thing is, the plan is static. And a plan you should have room for maneuvering within a plan. But a plan says we're going to do A, and then we're going to do B, and then we're going to do C, and then we're going to reach D. And what we are doing now is more an agenda that could have plans attached to it. But the agenda is move towards something that is more sustainable than what we have at the moment. And this could take different forms. It could, and we can talk about what these different forms could be, and what we need to do, and that's where the think tank part of what I mentioned comes in, is to really investigate the different forms, and not to try to put the cart before the horses, but to look at one form, for example, is territorial autonomy, like the people of South Tyrol have. That's the example we often go to because it's a good example. It's a province in the north of Italy that is governed very much autonomously, in the sense that it's inhabited primarily by Tyroleans, not Italians. They speak German, not Italian. And they, to a large, even though they are part of Italy, they govern themselves. And most of their tax money, they decide on how to spend it. They have their own parliament, even though they are citizens of Italy. And so if we take that example, we need to look into how they got there. What are the benefits of what they have? Does it work? Are there some serious pitfalls? And then apply that to our situation. and see, can we apply that? Is that perhaps a solution for where we are? But then there are other scenarios as well. Another one is what is called cultural autonomy, and that is something like a cultural community that is spread out over a large surface area that have, even though they are citizens of South Africa, that have a large degree of autonomy over their own affairs. For example, even have, to a certain extent, having legislative authority. So being able to make laws that are applicable to our people, to our community.
Yeah.
And there are examples of that. Estonia has some of that. Finland, Canada has some of that. And so we should go and look at to what extent is what they are doing in Estonia and something that we can apply in South Africa. And we only have an idea yet, but we should compare these different options. Maybe another option is just to say that we need much more explicit minority rights in the constitution. That's one option we should look into. And so I cannot say that I cannot paint a very vivid picture of that final destination, what it looks like. And I don't think that we should do that by now. I think we should have a broad idea of the direction, which is, again, decentralization of the political system and moving towards self-governance. And then to say, what are the options at our disposal and could they work in our scenario? And if they could, what are the steps that could be taken to take us closer to these solutions?
Is it not so, and correct me, I'm not a historian, is it not so that it will appear to me, if I look back at Europe and I look at the situation, Yugoslavia that broke up in balkanized in that part of the world. I look at the collapse of the Soviet Union and the different units that were created after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Is it not so, and this is the point I'm trying to get to, is that this natural identity that you talk about, and is something that I feel on my inside and you feel on your inside, that it is always connected to something physical, that physical piece of land that I'm talking about. And that put then next to that, the next thought that most wars, it will appear to me, are fought based on where those border lines have been drawn. In Africa as well. Africa has also just been carved up by the colonials, and that's probably why we have so many wars in Africa. You can talk about the same thing about what happened under communism or about the Yugoslav situation. My point that I'm trying to make is that there is this thing called my own internal identity. The language, the culture, the things that I associate with that makes me an Afrikaner. But it seems to me that that is inevitably attached to something physical.
Yes, absolutely.
A piece of land, a blue sky, something that is a space of my own. And all of these many words now is the question really for me is, you've not, in the process, you're not abandoning the concept and saying, no, the idea of a homeland for the Afrikaner, for example, and that probably sounds very crude, is not what's on the card here. There is something more in the form of how governmental structures would work, etc., etc. But, or can I just ask you then that bluntly, is the idea of a homeland part of the possible potential scenario?
Well, I think it certainly is. But the question is, what do we mean when we say homeland? But the idea of having your own place where you feel at home, where your community where you can make your own laws. You can decide what your children are being taught in schools. You can decide what your tax money is used on. You can be involved with your own city planning, and the people who represent you in government, whatever form that takes, are people that you know, that think like you. That is a noble cause worth pursuing. Unfortunately, and this is the problem with the modern era that we live in today, especially after the Berlin Wall fell, is that many of these things, even though they are perfectly natural and normal, have become very suspect. This idea of attaching value to your identity has become a suspicious thing in many circles, because we are today almost prescribed upon only to be individuals and nothing more. And if we are all just individuals, that means that we are all just the same. And then to come out and say, well, actually, we do naturally organize in groups, and groups have different proclivities, doesn't necessarily mean that the one is right and the one is wrong, but that's just a natural thing. Then there are some people who would try to present that as very suspicious, or even oppressive or evil or authoritarian. And I do think that there is value in that. And so the idea of land or soil, I think, is very important. People want, it's perfectly normal and natural and good for a community to say, we want our own piece of land. And that, again, that could take many forms. That could be, it could mean your own state.
Yeah.
It could be a place where you are left alone, where the EFF doesn't come and threaten to shut you down, for example. It could take different forms, and we should look into that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's very base. I don't buy into this idea that I can create what I will call a digital identity.
Yep.
Something that's out in the space. I don't believe that. I think that was the kind of language we use post 1990 in terms of ourself, our own language, our identity. I grew up, I'm much older than you. I grew up at a time in which I felt deeply attached to the soil of the land. We had the bluest skies in the world, the most beautiful land in the world. There was a physical attachment that gave me my identity. So the direction I'm going with this discussion is, can we solve the problem and not or ignore that fact of our humanness, of who we are as human beings, that attachment to earth, that attachment to that piece of land that we call our own? Can we ever find a solution without making that part of the deal?
I'm
dancing very politely around the same idea at the moment.
I don't think it's very easy or perhaps possible to find a solution in recognizing community dynamics without considering issues such as land and what you might call a homeland. I know that is a controversial term because it's associated with the apartheid system, but there are nations all over the world that govern themselves. Those who happen to be lucky enough to be organized in terms of states. So I've spent some time in Hungary, and one of the biggest differences, I've said this before, between the Afrikaners and the Hungarians is the Hungarians live in a country called Hungary. The Afrikaners live in a country called South Africa, which is more a name of a region than it is a name of a country. And so, and this, the Scottish, there are just examples all over, the French and the Germans and so forth. And it's difficult when you are a minority community that does not have the power or the authority to govern yourself. And wanting to do that, and again, that could take different forms, but wanting to do that is a noble pursuit. But it's unfortunate that there are people who are really hell-bent on trying to discredit the idea that wanting to have a higher degree of self-governance is a noble thing, who want to present it as some problematic thing. But I'm not too concerned about that. It's annoying, but I do think that this end of history idea that the final solutions have been discovered and the final solution is liberal democracy, and if you don't agree with that, then there's something wrong with you, is becoming increasingly discredited. And so the pendulum is swinging, and I think when we say that we need to move towards more self-governance, we're not saying move back into the past. We're saying we must move past what we have now into the future.
It's a little bit about what's happening in Europe as well, is the grabbing back of autonomy, the taking back from Central Europe, the laws that they're in control of, and wanting to have control over one's own destiny in one's own piece of land. To me, I just keep on connecting it, though, to, as I now said repeatedly, I don't think it's realizable without that very specific and very human attachment to a piece of identifiable land that I can claim myself. My brother phoned me the other day and he said to me, when I walk through the streets of my little village where I live in, they live close to Neisner, he said, I just don't feel that I belong here anymore. You feel that far more acutely, I'm being told by a journalist who's visiting at the moment from South Africa, when you are around Johannesburg or up in the north of the country, and people have that need to be able to identify with a piece of land that you can call your own, and that is part of your identity. I want to move the discussion a little bit away and towards why we think, because that's what I'm thinking at the moment, why we think we're in trouble with the multicultural democracy as we've attempted to build it in South Africa. Um, I noticed, I checked up on you a little bit this morning when I did a bit of research. Born in 1985,
Mhm.
that's literally 5 years before Nelson Mandela became a free man. That's incidentally the year that I left South Africa to come to Europe. It was in the midst of P.W. Botha's emergency rule
Oh, yes.
in
I
South
think the
Africa at the
Rubicon
time.
speech was that year as well.
It was a tremendously difficult time. And I remember when I arrived here in Europe, I probably learned more about my country and about apartheid and my history than ever before. But I also remember acutely being not wanted as an Afrikaner here. I was really, in Afrikaans, we use the word meishond. I'm not sure what a meishond is supposed to be in English, but we
Yeah.
were really the evil people.
Something like a pariah.
We were the pariah of the world. What I want to I'd like to know what your experience was. You grew up as a little boy, post the end of apartheid. When did you start learning about apartheid, and what is your connection with the apartheid history?
Well, I have some memories. Obviously, I have some memories from before 1994, but politically speaking, you could say I remember, watching the news at home with my parents. Not that I had a particular interest in watching the news, but when the news was on, I remember there was a show called Agenda, hosted by Max de Pre.
Yeah.
And I remember that a lot of people were angry with him with the things he was saying back in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember F.W. de Klerk being the president. I remember a news report, a particular news report that stuck with me about you could say, unbanning of Mkhonto Sizwe, or the rescinding of the declaration that it's an illegal organization. And I remember a news report about how the so-called soldiers of Mkhonto Sizwe are now returning to South Africa. And I remember there was a picture of Africa, and then there were these arrows moving downwards towards South Africa to illustrate this. I didn't really know what that meant. I do remember the. I actually don't remember much about the election in 1994. I think I was 9 years old, but I do remember vividly, for some reason, not so much the inauguration, that slightly, but the moment when they took down the old South African flag and replaced it with the new South African flag.
What did it mean for you? Just that. Let's just talk about that. What did that mean to you within your family? What was said in the family? What did you feel? How did you experience it? Was it positive? Was it negative? And I'm trying to juxtapose that
Yes.
to the idea of us here in Europe celebrating freedom and saying, at last, also the Afrikaner is free. This is the most free the Afrikaner had been ever. And I know that the Afrikaners were indeed very much a celebrated people here in Europe at the time. So I'm trying to puzzle
Yeah.
out for myself. Okay, and the reason why I want to go there is because I've also noted down here a few years later, when you were a young man, you were arrested, I read, because you were putting on a Pretoria sign on a highway. So I'm trying to imagine the evolution of this young Afrikaans white boy in Pretoria, his sense of his
Yeah.
awareness, his experience of the
Well,
new South
back
Africa.
then so I was born in Pretoria, but I grew up in Tzaneen, so
Mhm.
in the north of South Africa, in the
Mhm.
Limpopo province, a rural or an agricultural town, you could say. So we already lived there. I was very young when we moved. So Tzaneen is my frame of reference. Um, I, I, I didn't have much, you could say, political analysis of what was happening, but what I do remember is that I don't remember celebration. I remember people being concerned. So I grew up in a family that was not very political, in the sense that I can't remember my family talking much about, the National Party and the Conservative Party and things like that. My family was very, you could say, culturally conservative. So they were very much involved with organizations like the Voortrekkers,
Mhm.
cultural organizations. And so they were very culturally inclined, for which I'm very grateful. I was never really interested in party politics and elections and things like that. I was always much more interested in cultural dynamics. I do remember that people were concerned. I actually remember this as well. I remember when Chris Hani was killed, and I remember the news reports and people
Yeah.
talking about that. And I remember asking my father, who was Chris Hani? And he said to me, Chris Hani was the leader of the Communist Party. And I asked him, what is a communist? And I mean, I was like 8 or I think 6 or 7. And I remember he answered me, but I couldn't remember. It was too complicated for me to understand. But I remember people were alarmed. People were concerned that there would be violence, and people were concerned that the the ANC was not properly understood, that it was presented as this freedom-loving liberal movement when it was very much committed to communism, communist ideals. And that was sort of in the back of my head, even though I didn't really understand what communism was. Um, and so, but I think what just leading to the other part of your question, what made me much more aware of what was happening is growing up, being in school, growing up in Zanin, especially, which is an agricultural town. Um, it was at a certain point one of the areas in South Africa that was the most targeted with farm attacks. And so I grew up with that reality.
Okay.
This is something that I remember much more vividly of 1994, actually, is someone in our town, a very prominent person, had a very unfortunate incident. His wife was the mother or this wife of this person was kidnapped and raped. And I was 8 years old, and everyone was talking about this.
Yeah.
And so people had to explain that to me.
Yeah.
What does being kidnapped mean, and what does
Yeah.
being raped mean?
Yeah, pretty traumatic.
Yes, and so that, and then the farm murders, and I grew up with knowing people who were, I knew
Okay.
some people who were murdered,
Yeah.
but I also knew people and still know people who were attacked on farms, who were injured, who were paralyzed, and so forth. And so that I vividly grew up with that. And again, it was in the north of South Africa, and so I was in high school when the Zimbabwean crisis happened. And I remember watching that on the news, the land grabs and just how the economy crashed. And I didn't really understand inflation at the time. People had to explain it to me. But that it's the combination of the crime, especially the farm killings, and the learning what happened in Zimbabwe, which was about 2 hours drive from where we are.
Yeah.
That, and then that combined with my, you could say, cultural upbringing is what turned me into an activist.
Yeah,
in a
yeah,
sense.
yeah. To the extent where you became, in fact, defiant, and I would imagine probably you and a few buddies of yours or whatever,
Yes,
you
exactly.
jumped in a car and you go off and you go and plant this. This is sketch the scene to me. I'd like to just indulge in that for a moment.
So that was the arrest was
Is that
2010.
the birth of Ernst Roets, the actor?
Let me just say this. When I went to university, I studied law, LLB, University of
Yeah.
Pretoria. The first day, like it was opening day, I went immediately to the student societies and I looked for organizations where I could become more involved. So I didn't do very well in my undergrad studies because I was very much involved with student activities and things like that, and especially organizations that were more political but not necessarily political parties, or more cultural. I was involved with from day one at university. And so this was, I think, the year after I finished my LLB. It was the FIFA World Cup in South Africa, and there was this debate or this issue about changing the name of Pretoria to Tshwane. And the name has never been changed. What has happened is the name of the municipality has been changed to the Tshwane municipality, but the
Yeah.
name of the city is still Pretoria. And so during the FIFA World Cup, the local government put up signs all around Pretoria that said, "Welcome to Tshwane." And so me and a good friend of mine, James Kemp, we spoke about this, and we decided that I was involved with AfriForum Youth at the time, that we're going to make a big sign that says "Welcome to Pretoria" in 3 different languages, and we're going to put the sign up right in front of the one that says "Welcome to Tshwane," sort of as a way of protesting against this name change, the way it's being forced through. And we were busy, but it was actually funny because it was next to the N1, close to the R101 or the old Johannesburg Road. It's between Pretoria and Johannesburg.
Yeah.
And what we arrived with our pickaxes and with this big steel sign that we had made, and we really underestimated the soil. It was basically just rocks, and to
Mhm.
try to dig a hole to plant a sign was really something.
Yeah.
And we spent I don't know, an hour or two digging, and we were like, I don't know, we were like something like this deep, and then the police arrived, and we started sort of, I wouldn't say arguing in a certain sense, and they said we cannot plant a sign
Yeah.
here, and we typically student activists. We said,
Yeah.
well, we're not
Yeah.
planting a sign, we're just digging a hole, and so eventually they arrested us,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
we went
Yeah.
to jail. So I was in jail in Vierdabrug police station with this friend of
Yeah.
mine for a few hours, and eventually we were bailed out. And the only thing that we actually did wrong was parking on the side of the highway.
Yeah.
So we got tickets, we got fined for that. There's some laws about putting up signs next to the highway that we didn't even know
Yeah.
about,
Yeah.
but we didn't actually put up the sign. We were arrested before we could do that.
Yeah,
But
yeah. But the
it was
point,
quite an experience.
the point about it, Ernst, though, is that was an attack on your identity,
Yes,
and that is the reaction to that attack on that identity. And we've now talked a little bit about your natural identity and my suggestion that it cannot be without the attachment of the soil underneath your feet. We I want to talk to you about uh, post-apartheid South Africa and the attempt to build a nation, the multicultural, multiracial democracy. Um, do you think that South Africa was right from the start an illusion, an artificially created something that never really became, at the end of the day, attached to the deepest part of your inner being?
Do you mean South Africa from the start, as in from
As
1994?
in 1994, when we became a democratic South Africa, the new South Africa, as we called it, was the new South Africa, the creation of that new South Africa. The question, I guess, is have we been able to, in the last 30 years, build something that is close to what we will call a national identity?
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think. I think. Let me answer in two parts. One is the illusion part, and then the national identity part. So you could. I think it's easy to make the case that it was an illusion, but I would be more lenient and say that it was a hopeful ideal, and I did read up on that quite a bit when I did my master's degree, because my master's degree was on the extent to which minorities are protected by the South African Constitution, and there's a chapter in there about the process, Kudesa, the process of writing the Constitution and the debates regarding minority protection in particular. And I do think that there were some politicians who I think who were either malicious or oblivious to realities, and really pushing quite aggressively to have a certain system when I think there were reasonable arguments in favor of more decentralization of governance, and that's practical things like more power to the provinces. There were reasonable arguments of some form of self-determination when those who were in power, or the National Party and the ANC, made a deliberate attempt to ridicule the idea of self-determination at the time. So I think there were reasonable voices and there were reasonable arguments about things that should be considered that were not considered. It's easy to say with hindsight, of course, but I think there were really good people who were really hopeful that this is going to work. And I think it was correct to describe it. You mentioned this earlier. It was correct to describe it as an experiment, and it's okay for people to say that this is an experiment. Let's see if it works. But it turns out that it didn't work. So we must now learn from that experience. So that's the one side. The other side is the question of South African identity, which is an interesting thing. And again, I know this is a controversial thing to say, because almost everyone who lives in South Africa have a positive view of the idea of being a South African. And me too, depending on what you mean when you say South African.
Yeah,
When it means, if being a South African means being a citizen of the ANC government, that's not something that I think of in positive terms. But a lot of people, and I think this is something that people should think about. A lot of people in South Africa from different spheres of life want the South African dream to work or the South African ideal, but their precondition for South Africa to work or the South African dream to work is that other people who are not like me have to change and be more like me.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the dream, that if only people can be more, and I don't mean me, Ernst, I mean the people, the person having this dream. If your dream is that people who are not like you should change who they are to be more like you, then maybe your dream or your expectation is not realistic.
Yeah.
And so I think look, I'm very, very patriotic about South Africa. You don't need to get me started on that. And I don't foresee myself ever moving to another country.
Yeah.
But we have a very serious problem with the political system that we have in this country. And I think people would do well to recognize increasingly, and this is something that I would put a lot of effort on in the years to follow, that there's a difference between being loyal to the government or the political system and being loyal to your country. And I think we have reached the point in South Africa where these two things have become opposites or contradictory, where I would say if you are loyal to South Africa, you have to take a stance and say we need a better system. We need to move past what we have at the moment. But if being a proud South African, or if being proudly South African means you have to defend what we currently have, then I do think that is problematic. I think we should really think about what it means to be proudly South African.
Yeah, but I really remain puzzled for the simple reason that I hear everybody in terms of on the entire political spectrum and from all great race groups in South Africans kind of beating on the chest. I am a proud South African. That's what I hear. But if we're a proud South African, then we seem to me, if I look from afar, unable to define what that South African is or how we don't, but we are quite able to express our Afrikaans cultural identity, or for that matter, our English, colonial, whatever identity. So I'm not so sure if I know what a South African is, apart from the fact that I'm born in South Africa. I think you're smart enough to know where I'm going to with this question. So
there's a joke about this that I thought was quite funny about Heritage Day. So 24th of September, South Africa celebrates Heritage Day. And again, this is something where it's okay to celebrate, Zulu culture or something like that. But if you celebrate Afrikaner culture on Heritage Day, that's sort of frowned upon. But the argument behind Heritage Day is we need to celebrate our our joint or collective South African heritage. And then the question is, what is that? And so the joke is that the only thing that we could find that we all have in common is we eat meat that was cooked on a fire. And so we call it Braaidag or Bride Day.
And that's so, what the Norwegian ambassador or somebody made such a remark or something like that, which upset a lot of people. But I think really goes to the core of this whole question.
But the point is to say this is not to say that I have a fundamental problem with other people who live in this country. It's not to say that people are wrong. It's certainly not to say that people should be more like me. It's to say that people have different proclivities and we should respect that. But we are in a position today where we are so pressured to pretend as if there are no differences between people, as if people don't have cultural preferences. And I think cultural preferences are a beautiful thing. It's something that should be recognized and celebrated. But we've reached this strange point where diversity has become this buzzword that actually means the eradication of diversity. I think this is not sustainable because, and I think it's, just to get back to the point I made earlier, I think it's deeply racist, to use this buzzword, for a white person to think that the South African dream would work if only all those black people started to be more like I am, if they were sort of to leave their way of thinking and to adopt my way of thinking.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting by that or trying to suggest that white people have a culture and black people have a culture. There are different cultures within, among white people and among black people. But the only way that I see forward is to say that people have different preferences.
Mm-hmm.
Some are very culturally inclined, some people are not. But just to have some form of a recognition of this dynamic. But if the idea of South Africa is that we should try to suppress these things, and in as far as these things come to the fore, we should treat them as threats to our existence, that only means that the idea of South Africa is not going to succeed.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's why I say if we want to be patriotic about South Africa, we must also say, listen, we don't want to go back to the past, but we also need to move past what we have at the moment towards something that is more sustainable.
Yeah, yeah. I want to go through one or two questions more quickly with you. How successful do you think we were in terms of reconciliation in South Africa? The question that I'm really going to is, and that's why I also really wanted to find out a little bit more about how you grew up and how you became politically aware. I've had a few chats now with younger South Africans, black and white, and I find what I call a kind of an emotional disconnect with the history, or a lack of, in blatant terms, just not understanding or knowing our own history. And part of it is, I sometimes think, once again, looking from outside in, that I would suggest we're not very successful in terms of the Reconciliation Commission to tell each other our stories and to build relationships based on that.
Yeah. So I don't think South Africa has been successful in terms of reconciliation. It probably got worse. And some people have cautioned against this. I'm thinking of someone like Thomas Sowell, the African-American economist. Dinesh D'Souza has written about this in a book called The End of Racism. And what both of these people have argued, and there are many others as well, but I can reference these two, is that there is this false belief that if you force people to live together, they would eventually start liking each other more, and they would reconcile, and it would be good for relations, when what actually almost always happens is when you force people to live together, it leads to more friction in the long run as opposed to less friction. And I remember growing up, and of course it's easy to say something like this, but it really is true. I had my small group of friends who were Afrikaners like me, Afrikaans, and so forth. But in terms of numbers, I probably had more black friends than white friends. Because I can talk about children I played with on the farm growing up, black children. In the town, I was a skateboarder in school, and so I would go skateboarding.
I read you were a rocker as well.
Yes. And so I would play with the street children, the kids the homeless kids, who were all black, and I don't remember racism or something like that ever being a real thing, at least not from my perspective. I don't remember experiencing that. Now, I do think that largely speaking, let's put it this way. I think there are, and I've been thinking about this for a while, there are two narratives about South Africa that both seem true, but they contradict each other. And the one narrative is that South Africa is, broadly speaking, there's what people call a silent majority. Most people in South Africa are socially conservative, and the solution to South Africa is to get some form of a moderate conservative political party and get people to unite behind this.
Yeah.
Because broadly speaking, people in South Africa, regardless of your background or your culture, most people are Christians, and they value family values and so forth. And so that's the one. And also added to that is the notion that most people in South Africa don't really experience racism in their daily lives. They experience racism when they watch the news or when they go on Twitter, but not when they go to the mall. And so the argument is that people are very much reconciled in a certain sense. But then the other narrative, or the other part of the story, is that 65% of people in this last election voted for the ANC, for MK, and for the EFF. And so people vote for radical racist parties. And so how do you combine these two? And I think one part of the answer is, it goes back to this point of being South African, is that people have different perspectives of history. People have different perspectives of things like philosophy, and people have different cultural proclivities. And South Africa does not have a united vision of its past. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I have a very strong opinion about the vow of 1838 and the Battle of Blood River, because my ancestors were involved there. But I don't think it would be appropriate for me to expect a Zulu person to have the same view or the same narrative as I do. There are certain historical facts that you cannot disagree on, but within the facts, you can have a particular narrative. And so this thing of trying to think of the history of South Africa as if it's just one strand or one line is also, I don't think it's sustainable. We can recognize that we have a complex history and that there are different narratives. And some of these narratives, sometimes they seem to clash, but sometimes they could be contradicting narratives that can both be true. And I mean, there are many examples of that, but I don't think, I think in as far as reconciliation, to get to your question, implies that we must all be the same and we must all think the same way about history and identity and so forth. I think it has failed miserably. And I think the attempts to achieve this has led to more friction and more racism than what we had before.
Yeah, another quick question. Do you think that we white South Africans still have today, 30 years post-apartheid, a particular responsibility towards the rest of the people of South Africa? We talk now BEE, giving back. Do you think that we have that responsibility today still?
Yes, well, in a certain sense, yes. I think because people by definition have responsibilities, but
are you obligated to? And I mean, I'm really referring to the I just read yesterday or the day before about this new plans for Black economic empowerment. The new, I'm not quite sure what they call it. Yes. The idea that only 4% of white men will be able to gain employment in companies with personnel more than 50 people, something like that.
It's absolutely crazy how these race laws have turned out and how those in power are still trying to use this emotional game of blame shifting and trying to manipulate people emotionally into feeling, concluding that they have some form of an emotional responsibility, when it's very clear that these race laws have not only have they not worked, they've made things worse. And now it is argued that we have a moral responsibility to contribute to keeping them in place when they are not doing the basic thing that they proclaim to be doing, which is to uplift Black people in South Africa. These race-based policies in South Africa are aimed at making Black people dependent on the government, not making them independent, the exact opposite to that. Not on growing the economy sustainably. It's only based on redistribution. So it's destructive policy. So I would argue it the other way around, to say that we have a responsibility to fight against these laws, to take a very strong stance and not to cooperate. And I think this is something that the private sector has a big role to play that they aren't playing yet. I think we need more, you could use the word disobedience, by the private sector in South Africa to say, listen, these policies are destroying the economy. It's not good for anyone. And so at some point we need to take a stance. So I absolutely believe that if the question is about our moral responsibility with regard to things like BEE and so forth, I would say our moral responsibility is to actively fight against this. Not because we don't want to uplift Black people or anything like that. Obviously we do. But because these laws are not achieving this, they're achieving the opposite.
Yeah. Let me try to measure your sense of hope for the future. I want to tell you a story. Many years ago, I was in Switzerland, and I had probably my 10th or maybe even 20th meeting with Thabo Mbeki as a little South African journalist, and we were standing on if I remember, the shores of the Lac Leman in Montreux or something like that. And we were talking about me returning to South Africa, very personal, him smoking his pipe, and I smoked those days as well. And I had my cigarette, and we were looking at this magnificent sunset. And
Tell me, what year was this?
this was back in probably 1996, 7, roundabout there.
He was deputy president at the time.
He was then deputy president. Yeah, it could be later. I'm not quite sure. But I remember him saying to me, and I didn't quite understand what he was telling me. Only years later did I unpack exactly what he said. I was a very young and naive journalist, I think. He said to me that the ANC will the process in the future will take 3 major steps, and the first part of that plan of the African National Congress was taking control of the infrastructure, the organizational, the government, the police, the military, etc., the structures of government. That'll be phase 1. Phase 2 of the revolution he was describing to me was what he called a cooling down period. White people will get used to the idea of majority government. And then he said the third phase will be the economic revolution. Now, many years later, and I look back on that little chat that I had with Thabo Mbeki, I somehow realized that that was a summary of the National Democratic Revolution that he had sketched to me. And I totally misunderstood it. I totally did not. And this was an informal chat as well.
It's interesting, this cooling down comment, because it somewhere links up to this thing about the frog boiling.
The frog boiling theory that we
make the water warmer and warmer, and then we're going to wait for a while for you to get used to it before we heat it up even more.
Yeah, no, those were his words. And the other thing, and I'll get to the question. The other thing that he said to me is that the African National Congress has got, I used to say to friends of mine in Afrikaans, it's a lange asem, in Dutch, a lange asem. We're a patient organization, was really what he was saying. And now I sit here and I think, well, here we are, 30 years later, government of national unity. But hold on, the Bella Law has been signed some time ago. Expropriation without compensation law has been signed. I just read these new proposals for the BEE guidelines. My feeling is, if I look back at it all, it seems to me that Mbeki was quite right, that they do have a great deal of patience and seems to be just like a force just eating away and eating away, and is almost unstoppable. So this, back to my question, is your sense of hope, and can one turn some of these things around, or has it gone so far that it is inevitable?
No, I don't think it's inevitable. I think this analysis of the ANC playing the long game is a very good analysis. And I think that is one of the problems with, you could say, the Western approach, is Westerners, and especially Americans, but Westerners in general, tend to be very eager to get short-term results. We want to get results quickly. And that's difficult. And if you negotiate with someone who really plays the long game, China and the East is also very much more into the long game. And so that, I think that's a very apt description. And you're right. I think that is a description of the National Democratic Revolution. I think if the question is about hope or optimism, look, there are a lot of things to be pessimistic about, but I think there are also a lot of things to be optimistic about. But we must not be naively optimistic, and our optimism should be attached to you could say, to some form of a SWOT analysis, as I mentioned earlier. In other words, if we sit down and we say, in our position currently, what are our strengths, weaknesses, what are the opportunities, and what are the threats? I would say over the last few months, the threats have gotten bigger, but the opportunities have also gotten bigger. I think we have certain weaknesses. The biggest weakness is that we're a minority. Demographics is a weakness for us, but we have certain strengths as well. And I think especially the Afrikaner people have grown tremendously over the last few decades, to such an extent that and you might regard this as a bad thing or a good thing, but there's really a gap between younger Afrikaners and older Afrikaners. And it's not necessarily a gap to say there's a problem with the younger Afrikaners. There's always something to point out about the youth and why the youth are a problem and so forth. But young Afrikaners, my experience at least, is that younger Afrikaners at universities and high school and young employed Afrikaners are more conservative than older Afrikaners. They are, at least my experience, is more religious, more inclined to want to do something. When I think what I experience is that some older Afrikaners, and I'm generalizing perhaps to my own disadvantage here, but so a lot of them are quite tired, and I don't blame them because South Africa has had some turmoil over the last few decades, and a lot of people really felt that they lost, and I don't think, and I see this in a lot of small ways. How people talk about the past, how there were certain things that were taboo that are not taboo anymore among Afrikaners. And the biggest example is the word Afrikaner was a taboo word about 15 years ago. I remember at university, if you say I'm an Afrikaner or something like that, people immediately thought, okay, this guy has some racist agenda. So a lot of Afrikaners call themselves the Afrikaans speaking people.
Yeah.
When that, of course, isn't true, because there's a colored speaking community that is even bigger than the Afrikaners. And they don't regard themselves as Afrikaners. And so the word Afrikaner has made a comeback. And also, I think something else that I've seen that has made a comeback is talking about religion. And what I mean by that is, in my personal experience, I haven't read any studies about this, but that's just my personal experience, is let's say Afrikaners who are 50 years and older are much more hesitant to talk, let's say, to quote the Bible when they speak at some event.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that, because the belief or the experience was that the Bible was abused during the previous dispensation. There was this argument: is apartheid biblically justifiable, or does the Bible reject apartheid? And all the politicians trying to frame their political arguments in biblical terms. And so that's one of the big things I've noticed, is that people are very hesitant to, older Afrikaners or previous generation Afrikaners are much more hesitant to talk about the Bible. When I don't see that baggage among young Afrikaners. And so there's a lot, I think, to be optimistic about, but there are a lot of threats that we should take seriously.
Well, I'm much older than you. I'm obviously part of that older generation that you're talking about. I will give you a great compliment and hope you accept it in the generosity that I really mean it towards you. You are helping rebranding Afrikaners as you're sitting there right now, and as you've been going about. But just before we close, allow me just to become deep and pessimistic and grim, if you won't mind. The word genocide has been bandied around a lot in South Africa. I seem to recall that Tucker Carlson also used the term on a number of occasions in your discussion with him, and I saw you literally trying to sort of balance things out a little bit here. I was much aware of that. But if we're honest, there does seem to be something that we could call a genocide that is taking place right now as we speak in South Africa. I want to talk to you about that. I said to somebody the other day that I read somewhere, the British said you have to kill their leaders, you have to take away their language, you have to take away their culture, and make them like you. That's that's a perfect description of a genocide. Taking away the history, Afrikaner history, from our school classrooms is something that's very evident of that. Describe to me, in your words, how do you use and justify the word genocide?
Well, I have a joke about this, which is not just a joke because there's some truth in it. I think that I might be the person in South Africa who gets accused most of saying that there is a genocide in South Africa. And I might also be the person in South Africa who explains the most that it's not a genocide. But So the problem, I wrote a chapter about this in my book on farm killings, is does farm killings amount to genocide? Just looking at the farm killings. And I said, no, it doesn't. And some people are upset with me for saying that. And I go, it's some form of a legal technical argument. What is the definition of genocide? And one aspect thereof is you could call it central intent. So there must be some leader or that's at least from a legal perspective, what's the definition of it? Some leader or someone that says, listen, we need to go out and exterminate those people. And the farm killings, some of them are politically motivated, obviously, but there's no evidence of some form of a central intent. In other words, someone giving the command. What we do have evidence of is you could say genocidal rhetoric. You have politicians romanticizing genocide. And so the thing with the term genocide is when you use the word genocide, you think Rwanda, you think people running with machetes in the street, murdering every person, every Tutsi they see, or Nazi Germany rounding people up, sending them to concentration camps.
Yeah.
And my concern is if you describe South Africa as such, it's easy to make the counter argument and to say that that's not what's happening in South Africa. But I have made the case in my book that I explained that, and then I talk about the term crime against humanity. Could we describe what is happening against minorities in South Africa at the moment as a crime against humanity? And you might make that argument. And then there's the term ethnic cleansing, which is a bit broader than genocide. And so one way to explain the difference between genocide and ethnic cleansing is the difference between Adolf Hitler and Slobodan Milosevic.
Yeah.
The argument, at least, was that Hitler would have gone to the sort of corners of the earth to exterminate the Jews, to get rid of them. Milosevic just wanted the Muslim community and the minorities out of his country. And if they flourished or if they lived somewhere else, he would have been fine with that. He just wanted them out.
Yeah.
And so the point there is that ethnic cleansing is broader than genocide in the sense that this go back to Holland rhetoric could be a form of ethnic cleansing. It could be at least romanticizing of telling people just to get out of your place or get out of their place, taking the land. So if you combine the farm killings, the romanticizing of the farm killings, the go back to Holland rhetoric, the race discrimination, the targeting of statues and monuments, taking away Afrikaans education. If you add all of these things together, it actually becomes difficult to make the case that this is not ethnic cleansing. The problem with saying it's ethnic cleansing is then you become entrapped in a legal debate. What's the technical definition? And then
but
you
it's general understanding amongst the general populace.
So I would generally steer away from such legal terms because then you go into legal debates and just to try to explain the phenomenon for what it is.
Yeah, Ernst, you've really been very generous of your time with me. Now I'm going to make this my last question. Sure. And I asked this to somebody else as well the other day, what if we do create, or if we did create, a genuine democracy in South Africa, genuine equal rights in South Africa, no black economic empowerment or favoring one group over another group, no land theft, no discriminatory laws. What if we create a genuine democracy? Can we then blossom ultimately as a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural democracy?
Yeah, well, I don't want to be dark and pessimistic, but I would say one part of the answer is that depends on what genuine democracy means. I'm very much in favor of democracy. I just think that what we have in South Africa doesn't comply with what democracy is supposed to.
Which is my point, by the way, in this question.
Yes. So South Africa is majoritarianism. It's not democracy. And all the great thinkers about democracy has warned against the tyranny of the majority as a serious threat, as something that democracy could become, and then not being democracy anymore. John Adams wrote about this, one of the founding fathers in America. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about this in democracy in America, and I think Edmund Burke, in his reflections on the revolution in France, that when democracy becomes just majoritarianism, then it's not democracy anymore. And so, and it goes back to the question of natural identity. I would say democracy implies a community gets together and decides who their leaders are and how they want to be governed. And that's perfectly natural. But when, the metaphor of two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner, the question is that really democracy? And I don't think that is democracy. If that is democracy, then people would reject democracy as a political system. But if South Africa truly had a democracy, I would say that would imply a system in which different communities in South Africa had higher levels of self-governance, had higher levels of autonomy, and were able to cooperate on that basis. And that's the point. That's what I'm trying to argue for, and that's what we're trying to pursue with this Pioneer Initiative. Is in a certain sense, you could frame our whole mission statement differently. It's to say, let's get back to what democracy is supposed to mean, as opposed to this distorted thing that it has become. And I think if we really did that, I think South Africa would be much better off.
Yeah. Ernst, I believe on the 31st of May, you're going to actually launch the initiative. I guess it's going to have, by that time, probably a new name. Just in 2 or 3 sentences, what would be your first action?
So let me firstly say we had to move that closer. It would have been on the 31st of May. We're now going to do that on the 15th of May. The reason for that is that I was invited to speak at CPAC Hungary,
Fantastic.
the Conservative Political Action Conference, which is a big international conference in Budapest on the 30th of May. So we want to have this finalized before the conference. So we're going to have this launch on the 15th of May. We're calling it the Pioneer Initiative for now, because to be a pioneer is to sort of go out ahead, to sort of scout for new territory. And we have a more comprehensive policy framework, strategic objectives, and so forth already in place. We're engaging with some people to get that sort of finalized and sharpened. We're working on what the name of this institution will be. We asked our contributors. We don't have that many contributors because we're a new institution. We have a few hundred.
Yeah.
And we asked them, would you like to suggest some names? And within a few days, we got, just from our contributors, we got more than 50 names.
Fantastic.
And I myself have written down like 200 names. So the process of deciding on a name has become very
difficult.
Yeah. So but we have some good ones. I'm very excited about. So all of that will be announced on the 15th of May, and I'm very much looking forward to that. We'll have a new website. People can go to the Pioneer Initiative website right now and become a contributor if they want to. And on that day or on the 16th, the website would have been rebranded, and I'm very much looking forward to that. It's very exciting, and I can say that we have some big things lined up already, including having to go back to America to speak to some more podcasters, to speak on some additional platforms that are also quite big. Speaking at conference, I was invited to speak at a conference in America in June. I'm not yet sure if I'll be able to get there, but we have some big things lined up.
Yeah, we must try to get together for a few minutes when you're in Hungary to do something, Ernst.
Yes, absolutely.
I hope you're the best. Thank you very, very much for this discussion. I'm looking forward to talking to you again, and I'm really looking forward to hear what that new name is going to be for the Pioneer Initiative. Thank you very, very much, Ernst.
Thank you very much. It was great speaking with you.